If you've ever told yourself, just one more time, then you already know what direction your life is bending toward. Not slowly, not subtly, but quietly collapsing in plain sight. And if you are new here, understand this clearly. You are not watching entertainment. You are entering a different way of seeing your own behavior. For returning viewers and subscribers, this is continuation of a discipline you already started building: awareness, control, and psychological clarity over your own patterns. Turn on subtitles if you want to catch every detail, because what follows is not meant to be skimmed. It is meant to be recognized. Now listen carefully. The mind that says, just one more, is not weak in the way people assume. It is not broken. It is trained. Trained by repetition. Trained by comfort. Trained by reward without resistance. And that is why it feels so normal. You don't notice it at first. It begins with something harmless. A decision that feels too small to matter. One more scroll. One more video. One more drink. One more escape. One more indulgence you promise yourself will not repeat tomorrow. But tomorrow never arrives clean. It arrives already carrying the weight of what you repeated yesterday. There is a moment most people never pay attention to. It is not the act itself. It is the split-second negotiation before the act. The pause where your awareness whispers, stop, and your habit answers, just one more. That is the real battleground. Not the behavior, the permission. And every time you lose that moment, something inside you adjusts. Not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. You stop being someone who decides, and start becoming someone who reacts. There was a man who once believed discipline was about motivation. He would wake up with plans, structure, intentions. He would write them down like contracts with himself. But by evening, those contracts would dissolve. Not because he forgot them, but because, just one more, always sounded reasonable in the moment. One more break, one more distraction, one more delay before seriousness. He did not realize that his life was not being destroyed by big decisions. It was being rewritten by small permissions. And that is the part most people miss. You don't lose control in one moment. You surrender it in fragments. Until one day, you look at your behavior and don't recognize the logic behind it anymore. You just recognize repetition. There is a psychological mechanism behind this that operates silently. The brain does not respond equally to reward and restraint. Reward is immediate, emotional, and convincing. Restraint is delayed, abstract, and easy to negotiate against. So when you say, just one more, your mind is not debating morality. It is calculating comfort, and comfort always speaks louder in the moment. But here is what it does not tell you. Each repetition lowers the resistance threshold for the next one. The first time you override discipline, it feels like a decision. The 10th time, it feels like identity. And this is where people quietly cross a line without noticing. They stop saying, I did this, and start living as, I am someone who does this. Not because of a single failure, but because of accumulation without interruption. You may have seen this pattern in others before. The person who cannot stop at one drink. The person who cannot stop at one episode. The person who cannot stop at one distraction, one message, one escape from discomfort. And from the outside, it looks simple. Like lack of control, but internally, it is something more precise. It is a trained inability to tolerate interruption of pleasure. And that is far more dangerous than weakness. Because weakness can be corrected. But training requires unlearning, and unlearning always demands discomfort. Somewhere in this pattern, you begin to notice something strange about your own attention. You sit down with intention, and within minutes, your mind drifts toward escape. Not because you are incapable of focus, but because focus no longer feels rewarding without friction. You have conditioned yourself to expect relief immediately. And anything that does not provide it feels like resistance. This is why, just one more, is not a phrase. It is a system, a quiet agreement between impulse and identity. Now pay attention to this next part, because most people never connect it to themselves directly. Every time you obey that impulse, you are not just consuming a behavior. You are reinforcing a version of yourself that cannot interrupt itself. That version does not announce itself. It builds slowly through repetition. And one day, it starts making decisions for you before you even realize a decision was available. There is a reason Stoic thinkers emphasized control not as a dramatic act, but as a daily structure. Because they understood something most modern thinking ignores. You do not rise to your intentions. You fall to your unexamined patterns. And, just one more, is one of the most unexamined patterns in modern life. It disguises itself as harmless continuation. But psychologically, it is permission without reflection. And permission without reflection becomes identity without resistance. At some point, you may have noticed how certain habits feel automatic. Not because they are strong, but because they are familiar. Familiarity removes negotiation, and once negotiation disappears, behavior becomes mechanical. That is the stage where most people mistake awareness for control. They know what is happening, but they cannot stop it in real time. There is a difference between understanding your pattern and interrupting it. One is intellectual, the other is structural, and most people live entirely in the first, which is why they repeat the same cycle while fully aware of it. Now, here is where this begins to matter beyond observation. If you continue to live in the space of just one more, you will eventually discover that your attention, your discipline, and even your ambition start to fragment in the same way. Not all at once, but consistently enough that progress feels delayed without clear reason. You will start to think something external is interfering, but it is internal repetition doing the work, and it always begins with permission you thought was insignificant. There is a point where recognition alone is not enough. You can see the pattern clearly, yet still obey it. That is the uncomfortable reality of human behavior. Awareness does not automatically produce control. It only reveals the gap between who you are and who you act like when no resistance is applied. And most people avoid that gap, because it feels like contradiction. But it is actually information. Information about where your discipline is not yet anchored. At this stage, the mind often tries to justify itself. It says things like, "I deserve this," or, "I will stop after this one." And those statements feel reasonable because they reduce internal tension. But they do not change structure. They only delay consequence. And consequence always returns, not loudly, but consistently. You may already have felt it in small ways. The slow erosion of focus. The inability to start difficult tasks without delay. The subtle dependence on stimulation before action. These are not separate problems. They are connected expressions of the same underlying pattern. The pattern of not interrupting, just one more. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it in the same way again. Because it stops being about behavior, and starts being about identity formation. Somewhere in the middle of all this, you begin to realize something uncomfortable. The real limitation is not what you want. It is what you repeatedly allow. And what you repeatedly allow eventually becomes what you rely on. There is no dramatic moment where this becomes obvious. Only accumulation. Only quiet reinforcement. Only repetition that never meets resistance. And if nothing interrupts that cycle, the cycle becomes the architecture of your life. Not because you chose it consciously, but because you never opposed it consistently. That is where this story is heading. But not yet, because before anything can change, there is something you must see more clearly than comfort allows. And it begins with understanding what, just one more, is actually costing you in real time, not in theory. That part is not obvious until it is too late to ignore. What you call, just one more, does not stay in one part of your life. It spreads. Quietly, it starts influencing how you respond to discomfort, how you delay responsibility, how you interpret effort. And the most dangerous part is that it does not feel like decline while it is happening. It feels like choice. That illusion is what keeps it alive. At first, it only touches your small habits. The moments no one sees. The decisions you think are private. But over time, those private decisions begin to shape public outcomes. You don't notice the transition because nothing dramatic changes in a single day. But something is changing in your tolerance for resistance. There was a period in your life when discomfort meant action. When boredom meant creation. When silence meant thinking. But after enough, just one more, moments, discomfort begins to mean escape. Boredom begins to mean stimulation. Silence begins to feel like something that needs to be filled immediately. And that shift is not emotional. It is structural conditioning. Your brain learns the fastest route to relief, and it begins to prioritize it over everything else, including long-term consequence. Not because it is irrational, but because it is efficient in the short term. Efficiency is where most people lose themselves. Because what is efficient now is rarely what is aligned later. And the mind does not naturally prioritize later unless it has been trained to. This is where discipline is often misunderstood. It is not a personality trait. It is not intensity. It is not occasional control. Discipline is the ability to interrupt a pattern even when the pattern feels justified. And, just one more, always feels justified. It is designed that way. Think about how it sounds internally. It never arrives as destruction. It arrives as negotiation. It sounds like relief, not danger. It sounds like permission, not loss. That is why it bypasses resistance. There is a subtle shift that happens after repeated indulgence. You stop preparing for effort and start preparing for comfort. Your mind begins to anticipate relief more than challenge. And slowly, effort becomes something you postpone instead of engage. At that stage, even small tasks begin to feel heavier than they actually are. Not because they changed, but because your threshold changed. You are no longer responding to reality directly. You are responding to a conditioned expectation of discomfort. And that expectation shapes behavior before you even consciously decide. There was a moment in one man's routine where he noticed something strange. He would sit down to work, open what he needed, and within minutes, he would feel an urge. Not a strong one. A familiar one, a soft internal suggestion that said there is something easier you could do first. He called it a break, but it always extended. One more video, one more distraction, one more delay, then he would return and feel behind, even though nothing external had changed. This is how fragmentation begins. Not through chaos, but through micro escapes repeated often enough to interrupt continuity. And continuity is where strength actually forms. Without continuity, effort becomes scattered. And scattered effort never accumulates into mastery. It only accumulates into frustration. At some point, you may have experienced this yourself. Starting and stopping, planning and abandoning, focus that collapses without clear reason. And the assumption is usually lack of motivation. But motivation is not the missing variable. Tolerance is. Tolerance for staying in discomfort long enough for momentum to form. Just one more destroys that tolerance in small increments. Each time you obey it, you reinforce the idea that discomfort should be avoided immediately. And once that idea is stable, even minor resistance becomes a trigger for escape. This is why people can no longer sit with their own thoughts without reaching for something. Not because thoughts are dangerous, but because silence has been redefined as something uncomfortable rather than neutral. And once that redefinition happens, the mind stops existing in stillness. It starts existing in reaction. There is a point where you begin to notice something even more subtle. You are not choosing your distractions as much as you are arriving at them automatically. You open something without remembering deciding to open it. You switch tasks without completing the previous one. You interrupt your own focus without external interruption. That is not lack of discipline in the moment. That is loss of friction between impulse and action. And without friction, there is no resistance. Without resistance, there is no control. There is a reason people underestimate this stage. Because externally, life still looks functional. You still move, still speak, still operate. But internally, continuity has been replaced by fragmentation. And fragmented attention cannot build anything stable. Not relationships, not skills, not identity. Now here is the part most people avoid confronting. You are not dealing with isolated habits. You are dealing with a pattern that generalizes. If you cannot stop at just one more in one area, it will eventually appear in others. Not identically, but structurally. The same mechanism that delays one responsibility begins delaying another. The same tolerance for indulgence begins shaping your discipline in unrelated areas. It spreads because the root is the same. Permission without interruption. And once that becomes your baseline, effort must always compete with ease on unequal terms. Ease always starts first. Effort always arrives late. And late effort loses most of the time. There is a quiet cost to this that only becomes visible over time. It is not immediate failure. It is slower response to life. Less decisiveness. More hesitation. More internal negotiation before action. And negotiation, repeated enough, becomes avoidance. At some point, you may start noticing that you think about doing things more than you actually do them. That planning feels productive, but execution feels delayed. That intention is strong, but activation is inconsistent. This is not confusion, it is interference between awareness and action. And, just one more, is one of the primary sources of that interference. Because it trains you to break sequences before they complete. There is a reason continuity is uncomfortable at first for people trying to regain discipline. Continuity removes escape routes. It forces sustained engagement without interruption. And a mind trained on interruption interprets that as pressure. But pressure is not the problem. Inability to remain present under pressure is. And that inability is developed slowly, through repeated exits from discomfort that never get challenged. Now, if you are watching closely, there is a question forming underneath all of this. Not about habits, not about behavior, but about identity stability. What kind of person forms when, just one more, is the default response to internal resistance? That question is not theoretical. It is predictive, because identity is not built from intentions. It is built from repeated permissions. And repeated permissions always converge into a pattern. You may already see traces of it in your own decisions. Moments where you knew what should be done, but chose the easier continuation instead. Moments that felt insignificant individually, but familiar collectively. That familiarity is the warning sign. Because what feels familiar will eventually feel inevitable. And inevitability is where change becomes difficult. Not impossible, but expensive. Before that point arrives fully, there is still a gap between recognition and correction. Most people stay in that gap for years. Seeing the pattern, but not interrupting it. Understanding the cost, but still choosing temporary relief. And that is where transformation either begins or stalls indefinitely. Because nothing changes at the level of understanding. It changes at the level of interruption. The ability to say, not this time, when everything in you has been trained to say, just one more. That moment is not dramatic. But it is structural, and what you do in that moment determines whether the pattern continues to define you, or begins to lose authority over you. The next part is not about awareness anymore. It is about what happens when interruption actually starts to take place, even in small ways, and why the mind resists it more than expected. Because resistance is not just against discipline. It is against losing familiarity. And familiarity, even when destructive, feels like safety. The strange part about breaking a pattern is not the difficulty. It is the resistance that appears when you try to stop something you already know is harming you. That resistance does not sound logical. It does not present itself as fear or weakness. It presents itself as delay, as justification, as subtle internal negotiation that makes stopping feel unnecessarily extreme. This is where most people misread themselves. They assume they are deciding, when in reality, they are negotiating with a system that has already been reinforced for a long time. When you begin to interrupt, just one more, something unexpected happens. The mind does not immediately accept the change. It reacts as if something stable is being removed. Even if that stability was built on repetition of distraction, the brain treats it as familiarity, and familiarity is processed as safety. So the first response is discomfort. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are doing something unfamiliar. There was a man who tried to change his evening routine. Nothing extreme, just a simple rule. No more, one more, decisions after a certain point in the night. No extra scrolling, no extra stimulation, no extra delay disguised as rest. The first night, it felt artificial. He kept reaching for something without needing it. Not because he wanted it strongly, but because his mind expected it. The expectation itself created tension. And that tension is what most people interpret as failure. But it is not failure. It is withdrawal from a pattern that used to regulate comfort. When you remove that pattern, the mind briefly loses its shortcut to relief. And it does not like losing shortcuts. This is where discipline is often misunderstood again. People think discipline is about forcing action. But in reality, it is about tolerating the absence of automatic escape routes long enough for new structure to form. And that gap is uncomfortable. Because you are no longer reacting. And you are not yet stabilized. You are in transition between two identities. One built on repetition without interruption. The other built on interruption without permission. And in that space, the mind tests you. It will offer compromises. Small ones. Harmless ones. Just this time. Just tonight. just a little longer, and each compromise is framed as minimal. But structurally, it is the same pattern reasserting itself. The mind does not fight discipline directly. It tries to reintroduce negotiation. Because negotiation is where control was previously lost. There is a deeper mechanism underneath this that most people never observe. When a habit is repeated enough times, it becomes part of predictive processing. The brain begins to anticipate it before it happens. So when you interrupt it, the system experiences a mismatch between expectation and outcome. That mismatch is uncomfortable, not morally, neurologically. It creates a sense of tension that pushes you toward restoring the expected pattern. This is why breaking, just one more, feels harder than it logically should. You are not only resisting action, you are resisting prediction itself. And prediction is deeply embedded. So the discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the system is updating. But most people never stay long enough in that discomfort for the update to complete. They return to the familiar pattern to relieve the tension. And in doing so, they reinforce the same loop they are trying to escape. This is the hidden trap, the relief that reverses progress. At some point, you may notice a strange psychological moment. You decide not to continue a behavior, and immediately your mind offers reasons why continuing, just one more time, would not matter. The arguments feel reasonable, almost responsible, as if stopping would be excessive. This is not reasoning, it is habit defending itself through language. And if you listen closely, you will notice it always speaks in minimization. It never says, abandon discipline. It says, delay it slightly. That is enough, because discipline is not destroyed in opposition. It is eroded in postponement. There is a difference between someone who never intends to change and someone who keeps postponing change through micro-permission. The first is stable in direction. The second is unstable in execution. And instability in execution creates the illusion of inconsistency, even when intention remains strong. This is why people often feel stuck despite knowing exactly what they should do. They are not lacking knowledge. They are lacking interruption at the moment of transition. The moment where, just one more, appears. And here is where something important becomes visible. When you successfully interrupt that moment, even once, something shifts internally. Not dramatically, but structurally, you begin to experience a gap between impulse and action. A small space where choice becomes visible again. That space is where control lives. But it is fragile at first. Because the mind will attempt to collapse it back into automatic behavior. This is why early discipline feels unstable. You are not yet free from the pattern. You are only creating distance from it. And distance must be maintained before it becomes identity. There was another man who noticed this clearly. He did not try to remove everything at once. He only focused on one rule: no continuation without awareness. If he felt the urge to extend a behavior, he paused long enough to notice the urge instead of obeying it immediately. That pause felt unnatural at first, almost unnecessary, but something changed over time. The urgency did not disappear, but its authority weakened, and that is the key difference. You do not eliminate impulse. You reduce its automatic control over action. But the process is slow. Because every interruption is met with internal resistance that feels like discomfort. And discomfort is often misinterpreted as wrong direction, when it is actually the signal of rewiring. This is why most people retreat. They mistake resistance for danger, when it is actually transition. Now consider what happens if you never interrupt it. If, just one more, continues uninterrupted across days, weeks, months. The mind begins to build a consistent expectation that resistance will always be overridden. And once that expectation stabilizes, discipline is no longer something you lose occasionally. It becomes something you rarely access at all, not because it disappeared, but because it was never reinforced. At that stage, even small decisions feel heavier than they should. Not because life is harder, but because internal initiation is weaker. Starting becomes delayed, continuing becomes inconsistent, stopping becomes automatic, and this reversal of control is subtle enough that most people rationalize it instead of correcting it. They say they are tired. They say they are busy. They say they will restart later. But later is where patterns survive, and survival of pattern is how identity stabilizes. There is a moment in this process where a choice becomes unavoidable. Either you continue allowing just one more to act as default permission, or you begin introducing interruption as a new baseline. Not perfection, interruption. Because discipline does not begin with total control. It begins with breaking automatic continuation. And that is where most transformation actually starts, even if it does not feel significant at the time. The mind resists it because it removes comfort. But comfort was never neutral. It was shaping direction. And now, the question becomes unavoidable. If you continue to obey what feels comfortable in the moment, what version of you is being reinforced without your awareness? That question does not need an answer immediately. It needs observation. Because the next stage is not understanding the pattern again. It is experiencing what happens when you refuse it in real time, and how the identity reacts when its smallest permission is no longer guaranteed. That reaction reveals more than theory ever could. And it begins exactly where most people usually say, just one more. There is a specific moment where everything changes, but it does not announce itself. It happens quietly, inside a decision that looks almost identical to every previous one. The same situation appears, the same urge rises, the same familiar sentence forms in your mind. Just one more. But this time, something interrupts it before it completes. Not strength, not motivation. Awareness that arrives slightly earlier than habit. And that small difference is enough to create a gap where there used to be none. In that gap, the entire system hesitates. Because for the first time, the pattern does not receive automatic permission. What most people do not realize is that habits do not survive on desire alone. They survive on speed, on how quickly impulse turns into action without interference. When that speed is broken, even slightly, the pattern loses authority. But losing authority feels uncomfortable at first. Because your mind interprets interruption as disruption of identity, not correction of behavior. You are not just stopping an action. You are contradicting a version of yourself that has been reinforced through repetition. That contradiction creates internal friction. And friction is where most people retreat. They return to just one more, not because they believe in it, but because it removes friction instantly. So the cycle continues, until someone stays inside the friction long enough to realize something subtle. The discomfort is not escalating. It is stabilizing. It stops increasing once you stop feeding it. And that is the moment where control begins to form. Not as dominance, but as tolerance. The ability to remain present without collapsing into escape. There was a point in one man's routine where he stopped negotiating with himself in the moment of impulse. Not dramatically, not through force. He simply noticed that every negotiation always ended in the same place. Extension, delay, repetition. So he stopped engaging the negotiation. At first, silence followed the urge. And that silence felt unfamiliar. Because previously, every urge had an immediate response. Now there was space. And in that space, something important became visible. The urge did not require action. It only required attention. And attention alone was enough to weaken it. This is the part that challenges most assumptions about discipline. You are not fighting impulses. You are interrupting automatic compliance with them. Once compliance is interrupted, impulse loses its authority over behavior. But the mind resists this because it prefers certainty, even if that certainty is destructive. Just one more is certainty. It guarantees continuation. It removes uncertainty about stopping. And that is why it feels comforting. Even when it is costing you something long-term. So when you remove it, you are not only changing behavior. You are removing a form of psychological predictability. And predictability is what the mind mistakes for safety. This is why transformation feels like instability before it feels like strength. You are no longer predictable to yourself. But you are not yet stable in new behavior. That in-between state is where most people give up. Because nothing feels fully controlled. And everything feels slightly unfamiliar. But if you remain in that state long enough, something reorganizes. The impulse still appears, but it no longer dictates outcome automatically. There is a pause, and in that pause, identity begins to shift. Not because you declared it, but because you stopped reinforcing the previous version of it. There is a quiet truth here that rarely gets articulated clearly. You do not become disciplined by adding control. You become disciplined by removing automatic permission for indulgence. That is a different process entirely. Addition creates pressure. Removal creates clarity, and clarity is what allows control to stabilize. Now, think about how many times, just one more, has appeared in your own decisions. Not as a dramatic failure, but as a subtle continuation. A moment where stopping was available, but continuation felt easier. Each of those moments trained your system. Not in failure, but in response speed. And response speed determines identity more than intention ever does. If impulse always wins the race to action, then impulse becomes identity. If awareness sometimes interrupts impulse, then identity begins to split. One side is automatic, one side is conscious, and whichever side wins more consistently becomes who you are in practice, not theory. This is where the real work begins. Not in eliminating desire, but in redefining response. There will still be urges. There will still be moments where continuation feels easier than stopping. But the difference now is that you can see the moment before it becomes action. And seeing is the first separation from automatic living. At this point, discipline is no longer an abstract idea. It becomes a series of micro-decisions where you either reinforce pattern or interrupt it. There is no neutral state. Every, just one more, either strengthens automation or weakens it. And over time, those small choices accumulate into a direction. Not immediately visible, but structurally irreversible if sustained long enough. This is where most people underestimate themselves. They assume transformation requires dramatic overhaul. But in reality, it requires consistent interruption of one specific pattern until it loses authority. Not removal, authority loss. Because once a pattern loses authority, it can still appear, but it no longer leads. It becomes noise instead of command. And that changes everything. There is a moment in this process where you start to notice something unusual. The urge still shows up, but it feels less convincing, less urgent, less automatic. You are not stronger than it in a forceful sense. You are simply less obedient to it. And that difference is everything. Because obedience is what creates identity reinforcement. Now, if you step back and look at the entire pattern, something becomes clear. Just one more was never about the thing itself. It was about permission loops. Loops that trained you to extend comfort at the expense of direction. And breaking that loop does not require perfection. It requires interruption at the exact point where permission is normally granted. Not after, not before, at the moment itself. That is the entire structure of change. And it is quiet, almost invisible from the outside. But internally, it is the difference between a life governed by impulse and a life governed by observation. There is no final state where impulses disappear. There is only a state where they no longer make decisions for you. And that is where strength actually forms. Not in suppression, but in awareness that does not yield automatically. So the next time, just one more, appears, it will feel familiar. It will feel reasonable. It will feel like nothing significant is at stake. But what is at stake is not the action. It is the continuity of a pattern that either remains in control or begins to lose it. And in that moment, nothing external will decide for you. Only the space you create between impulse and response. That space is where identity is rewritten. Quietly, without announcement, without recognition, until one day, you realize the sentence no longer controls you the way it used to. And that is when you understand what was actually being built all along. Not restriction, but sovereignty over repetition. Now the pattern does not end. It only loses authority. And from here, what you choose to repeat is no longer automatic. It is deliberate, silent, and yours.